New York City, 1892. A Sicilian immigrant named Giuseppe Morello arrives in East Harlem with nothing but a withered right hand and an ambition that has no ceiling. Within a decade, he controls the streets. Within 2 decades, his organization controls the neighborhood. Within a century, the family his gang became would be described by the FBI as the most powerful, most sophisticated, most secretive, and wealthiest criminal organization in the United States. More made members than any other family, more revenue than most corporations, more political connections than most governments. And for 30 years, its most powerful boss ran the entire operation while wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, talking to parking meters. The FBI watched him do it every day for 3 decades and couldn't touch him. This is the story of the Genovese crime family, the gang that didn't just operate in New York's underworld, they owned it. Picture this moment first. 1997, a federal courtroom in Manhattan. A 69-year-old man shuffles to his seat. He is wearing a wrinkled suit. His eyes are vacant. He appears confused. His lawyers have spent years arguing he is too mentally ill to stand trial. 28 psychiatric evaluations. 28 times the courts considered dismissing the case. The man's name is Vincent Gigante. His nickname is the Chin. And behind those vacant eyes, behind the shuffling walk and the muttered nonsense, is the boss of the most powerful organized crime family in America. A man who has been secretly running a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars for 2 decades while pretending he doesn't know what year it is. The judge looks at him and says 4 words that end 30 years of theater. The act is over, but to understand how one man could fool an entire government for 30 years, and why the family he led was so powerful that even after his conviction it kept running, we have to go back, all the way back to the beginning, to a blood-soaked restaurant in Coney Island, and the man who built the machine. Before there was a Genovese family, before there were 5 families at all, there was a war. The late 1920s. New York City. 2 factions of the Italian-American underworld are killing each other in the streets. On one side, Giuseppe Masseria, known as Joe the Boss, a powerful, stubborn, old-world Sicilian who believes the Mafia should be run exclusively by men from the old country and refuses to share power with anyone outside that circle. On the other side, Salvatore Maranzano, another old-world Sicilian, another man who believes power should flow through him alone. Between them, 60 dead bodies, bosses, underbosses, captains, men dying on both sides in a conflict that is making everyone less money and generating more heat from law enforcement than anyone can afford. And watching this war from the middle, a young Sicilian American from the Lower East Side named Charles Luciano, known as Lucky. Lucky Luciano had a problem with both men, not because they were violent, because they were stupid. They were fighting over an old world that no longer existed, refusing to work with Jewish gangsters, refusing to work with non-Sicilians, refusing to see that the way to build real power in America wasn't to act like you were still in Sicily. It was to act like you were running a business. So Luciano made a decision. April 15, 1931. He invited his boss Joe Masseria to a restaurant in Coney Island. They ate, they played cards, and then Lucky excused himself to go to the bathroom. While he was gone, 4 gunmen walked in. Masseria was shot 4 times. He died clutching an ace of spades. With Masseria dead, Luciano turned to his new ally Maranzano, accepted a position under him, and then 5 months later, sent 4 men disguised as federal agents to Maranzano's office on Park Avenue. They disarmed the bodyguards and killed Maranzano at his own desk. In a single year, Lucky Luciano had murdered his way to the top of New York's criminal world. Both bosses, gone. But here is where Luciano did something that no gangster before him had done. He didn't declare himself the new boss of bosses. He didn't try to consolidate all power in himself. He called a meeting of crime bosses from across the country, and he proposed something radical. A corporation, the Commission, a governing body for the entire American underworld. 5 families in New York, plus representation from Chicago, Buffalo, and other cities. Each family with defined territory, each boss with a seat at the table. Disputes settled through the Commission, murders requiring Commission approval. Lucky Luciano had just invented the most sophisticated criminal governance structure in American history. And he placed himself at the head of the family that would eventually become the most powerful of all 5. The family that bore a different name then, the Luciano family. But here is the question. Nobody asks, what happens to a machine this powerful when its creator goes to prison? In 1936, District Attorney Thomas Dewey convicted Lucky Luciano on pandering charges. 30 to 50 years. The most powerful criminal in America was gone. locked in a cell. The empire he built needed new management. Two men stepped into the vacuum. First, Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the Underworld, a man so politically connected that his reach extended into courtrooms, City Hall, and the state legislature. Costello didn't run the family through violence. He ran it through influence, through relationships, through the understanding that real power doesn't announce itself. And second, Vito Genovese, Luciano's underboss, a man with a very different style. Here is what Vito Genovese did within 1 year of his first wife's death. He wanted to marry another woman, a woman named Anna Petillo, who was already married. On March 16, 1932, Anna's husband, Gerard Vernatico, was found strangled on a Manhattan rooftop. 2 weeks later, Vito Genovese married his widow. That was the kind of man Vito Genovese was. By 1937, facing murder charges in New York, Genovese fled to Italy. He took $750,000 in cash and went to ground near Naples. While there, he befriended Mussolini's son-in-law. He donated nearly $4 million to the Italian Fascist Party. He continued running criminal operations from overseas. He maintained his empire from across an ocean. When American troops arrived in Italy during World War II, Genovese insinuated himself into the Allied operation as an interpreter, while simultaneously running one of the largest black market operations in southern Italy. The army eventually figured it out and shipped him back to New York to face murder charges. The charges collapsed when 2 key witnesses were killed before they could testify. Vito Genovese walked out of the courthouse a free man. He was back, and he wanted his family back. By 1957, Frank Costello had been running the family for 20 years. He had built it into the dominant force in New York's underworld through political connections and carefully managed relationships. Vito Genovese wanted it back. May 1957, Costello is walking through the lobby of his apartment building in Manhattan. A man steps out of the shadows. The gunman fires once. The bullet grazes Costello's skull. He falls. The gunman flees, saying out loud, "This is for you, Frank," which is how investigators later identify the connection. Costello survives, but he understands the message. He retires, quietly, immediately. Genovese is now the boss. His first act, organize a summit of Mafia bosses from across the country. Over 100 men gather at the estate of a crime boss in Appalachian, New York, in November 1957, the largest gathering of organized crime figures in American history. A local state trooper notices an unusual number of expensive cars parked outside. He calls it in. Law enforcement surrounds the property. Bosses scatter into the woods in their expensive suits. 60 are arrested. The American government, which had spent years with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly denying that organized crime existed, was now looking at photographic evidence of over 100 crime bosses gathered in a single location. Genovese had intended to use the Appalachian meeting to consolidate his power. Instead, he had accidentally revealed the existence of the entire American Mafia to the United States government. His rivals, Luciano, Costello, Carlo Gambino, quietly used his embarrassment against him. They lured Genovese into a drug-dealing scheme. He was arrested, convicted, sentenced to 15 years. The man who had spent 2 decades clawing his way to the top of the most powerful criminal organization in America was in a federal prison cell by 1959. He would never leave. Vito Genovese died in a prison hospital on Valentine's Day, 1969. But the family he gave his name to? It didn't skip a beat. Here's what makes the Genovese family different from every other criminal organization in American history. When their boss went to prison, they didn't fall apart. When their boss died, they didn't fight over succession. When the government came after them, they didn't crack. They adapted. The man who eventually took control in 1981 was Vincent Gigante, the Chin, a former professional boxer from Greenwich Village whose mother called him Vincenzo. He had been Genovese's personal enforcer. He had been the gunman in the failed 1957 assassination attempt on Frank Costello, the shooting that started Genovese's takeover. By the time Gigante became boss, he had already been running a piece of the operation for years, and he had already been running the most extraordinary deception in the history of organized crime. Starting in the late 1960s, Vincent Gigante began wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, muttering to himself, talking to parking meters, urinating in public, playing pinochle in storefronts, shuffling past his neighbors like a man whose mind had simply left his body. FBI agents watched him do it. Every morning, for years, they photographed him. They documented his behavior. They brought in psychiatrists, 28 separate psychiatric evaluations. Some declared him incompetent to stand trial. Cases against him were dropped. While this was happening, Gigante was running the most powerful criminal organization in America, from a social club across the street from his mother's apartment. The Triangle Civic Association, 208 Sullivan Street, a nondescript room with nothing inside but a bar and an espresso machine. He held court there every day, issuing orders in whispers, never using the telephone. Soldiers who wanted to reference him were forbidden from saying his name. They would point to their chin instead. He used frontmen to absorb indictments. He used layers of intermediaries, so his voice never appeared on any wiretap. He ran the family's operations through his underboss, while maintaining complete plausible deniability. The FBI knew he was the boss. Every informant said so. Every wiretap caught people discussing him. But every time prosecutors tried to bring him to trial, his doctors produced psychiatric reports. His lawyers produced evaluations. His neighbors produced testimony about the confused old man who wandered the streets in his bathrobe. Sammy the Bull Gravano, the Gambino family's underboss who eventually became the most significant mob informant in American history, later said of Gigante, "It was clear as a bell that he was the boss. So why was he doing his nut act? Because it worked. For 3 decades it worked." FBI agents once arrived at his mother's apartment to serve a subpoena. They found Vincent Gigante in the shower, under a closed shower head, in a bathrobe, holding an open umbrella over his head. In 1997, a federal judge finally declared him competent to stand trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Hidden recordings, informant testimony, a paper trail that prosecutors had been assembling for 20 years. He was convicted of racketeering and murder conspiracy, sentenced to 12 years. Even in the courtroom, he sat slumped, barely speaking, maintaining the act until the very end. In 2003, facing additional obstruction charges, and with his health declining, Gigante finally admitted the truth. The bathrobe, the muttering, the psychiatric evaluations, the parking meter conversations, the umbrella in the shower, all of it, a performance. 30 years of theater. 30 years of walking the streets of Greenwich Village dressed like a confused old man while secretly running an organization that generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually. A federal court described it as the most successful long-term fraud ever perpetrated against the American justice system. He died in a federal prison hospital in 2005. But here is what nobody warned the government about. The machine didn't need him. While the Gambino family fell apart after John Gotti's conviction, while the Lucchese family fractured when its members turned informant, while the Bonanno family was infiltrated so completely by the FBI that its own boss became a government witness, the Genovese family kept running. The FBI considers them the last functioning major criminal organization in the United States operating at anything close to peak capacity. Not because they are the most violent, not because they are the most fearless, because they are the most disciplined. In the entire history of the Genovese family, only 11 members have ever cooperated with law enforcement. 11. Out of hundreds of made members and thousands of associates spanning nearly a century of operation. For context, the Bonanno family's boss personally flipped. The Gambino family's underboss gave prosecutors everything they needed to dismantle the commission. The Lucchese family was essentially disassembled from the inside by its own people. The Genovese family has watched every other major criminal organization in America crack under government pressure and held their revenue streams survive in different forms: the waterfront, the construction industry, labor racketeering, sports betting now online, financial fraud, the quiet extraction of money from industries that require peace with the men who can take it away. In 2025, federal authorities unsealed indictments charging members of the Genovese family alongside members of the Gambino, Lucchese, and Bonanno families and 2 NBA figures in a scheme to rig high-stakes poker games across the United States. Still operating, still adapting, still finding the next gap in the system to exploit. The Triangle Civic Association at 208 Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village, where Vincent Gigante once held court in his bathrobe while running the American Underworld, is now a tea shop. You can go there, order a cup of tea, sit where one of the most powerful criminals in American history conducted his business while pretending to be insane. Nothing marks the spot. Nothing explains what happened there. Just a counter and a menu and the smell of something warm. The Genovese family began with a Sicilian immigrant in East Harlem in 1892. It survived Prohibition, survived the Castellamarese War, survived Lucky Luciano going to prison, survived Vito Genovese going to prison, survived the Appalachian disaster, survived Rico, survived the Commission trial, survived the systematic dismantling of every other major criminal organization in New York. It survived a boss who spent 30 years in a bathrobe convincing the world he had lost his mind, while running an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The FBI called them the Ivy League of the underworld. They didn't mean it as a compliment. They meant it as a warning. Every other gang in New York's history has had a moment where the center couldn't hold, where someone talked, where someone got greedy, where someone made the mistake that unraveled everything. The Genovese family's secret isn't violence. It isn't money. It isn't territory. It's discipline. The discipline to stay quiet when every instinct says to speak, to stay invisible when every temptation says to be seen, to let other men take the credit, the attention, the headlines, and the indictments, while the real machine keeps running underneath. Lucky Luciano built it. Vito Genovese named it. Vincent Gigante protected it with 30 years of theater. And somewhere in New York right now, it is still running. Not in a bathrobe, not in a social club with an espresso machine, in an office, in a construction company, in a labor union, in a financial firm with a legitimate name on the door and a very different name on the paperwork underneath. The gang that controlled New York's underworld didn't survive for a century through brutality. It survived through something much harder to prosecute: patience. The Genovese family built their empire on 19 different revenue streams, from garbage to Wall Street to cryptocurrency. We broke down every single one of them in our last video. If you want to understand the machine, that's where you start.